Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of UBS Road to the Election, an Election Watch series. I'm thrilled to welcome today's guest, Alejo Czerwonko, Chief Investment Officer of Emerging Markets Americas here at CIO, UBS Global Wealth Management. Alejo, always a pleasure to sit with you. Great to have you in the studio with me.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
So I know for this series, so far, we've only been talking about the election here in the United States that's coming up in November. But we're not the only country that's holding elections. So tell us globally, there's some big elections that are happening. What are some of those that you're keeping an eye on?
That's right, Anthony. It's going to be quite a year from an elections perspective. If you think about it, over 80 nations making up over 60% of the global GDP, over 50% of the global population will go to a vote at some point in 2024. And as you know, Anthony, investors feel a deep sense of unease whenever there is elevated policy and electoral uncertainty. So we have a year in which I think we're going to have to coexist with this type of uncertainty. And there's a lot that, as investors, we won't be able to control.
Right. You use the word angst when you think about, well, you wrote it in a recent report. You talk about angst, especially in a closely divided election, which we expect will happen here in the U.S., as we've seen in the past. But that's not the case for some of the other countries that we're keeping an eye on, correct? I mean, obviously, U.S. is one thing, but Mexico, you were talking about, one of their biggest elections of all time. Talk about that.
That's right. I think when, as an investor, you think about whether you should worry about an election or not, you should probably ask 4 questions. Number 1, what's at stake? A local election is not nearly as relevant as a general election, of course. Number 2, how tight is the race? A competitive election is more angst-inducing than an uncompetitive election because at least in an uncompetitive version, you have visibility and you can prepare for the outcome. Number 3, how resilient is the democratic process in which the election takes place? Because if you think about a country with clear rules of the game and where players are likely to accept those rules of the game, then as an investor, you have more reassurances that whatever outcome takes place, you can rely on. And finally, number 4, how much does this election matter for the broad, the world at large, in a way, right? So if the election takes place in a larger economy or in a place where you have deeper capital markets, this is a more impactful election. So these are some things that you should consider.
Right, exactly. And with, I know I alluded to this pretty quickly, but because I'm fascinated by what's happening in Mexico, the election this year that's taking place in June. You said it's the biggest election the country's ever seen. And you threw out a number that my jaw dropped. Tell me what that is again.
It's mind-blowing.
Yeah.
We're talking about early June, 20,000 officials will be elected into office.
I said to you, how does somebody even keep track of that? It's an editor's worst nightmare to make sure you get all the winners' names correctly. 20,000. That's unbelievable.
Without a doubt. Now, when you think about what really moves the needle, the presidential contest, there we have a fairly uncompetitive situation. The leading candidate is polling at over 65% approval rating. Therefore, if you think about which is the election that is less visible, right? The U.S. election or the Mexican election. You could argue pretty comfortably that it's the U.S. election.
Absolutely, yeah. Talk about the angst as people go to the polls. But let me back up a little bit because you are, of course, as being our emerging markets CIO, you're looking at everything going on around the world, including the U.S. But from maybe what a U.S. voter or investor doesn't realize is that the U.S. election is extremely important to global voters, not just voters here in the U.S. and investors as well. Why is that? Why is it so compelling to a global audience, not just our own citizens here in the United States?
Without a doubt. We come back to the questions you should ask to determine whether an election is relevant or not relevant for a global investor. And you think about, number 1, what's at stake? Number 2, how tight is the race? Number 3, how resilient is the democracy in the country where the election takes place? And number 4, how impactful this election might be from an economic and financial markets perspective. Then out of the 80+ elections in the world this year, the U.S. stands out by a wide margin. If you add to that the fact that U.S. presidents have quite a bit of agency when it comes to determining the international affairs direction of the country, this election really impacts just about every other country in the world.
Right. And without even getting into the specifics of what a Trump 2.0 presidency looks like and a Biden 2.0 presidency, we know without even going into it the potential policy either changes or updates that could happen that affect us here in the U.S. and, of course, our global neighbors as well, because we have a lot of foreign policy initiatives on the docket, regardless of who actually sits in the White House next year.
Absolutely. And I can guarantee you that the most important election in Europe is the U.S. election. The most important election in Mexico is the U.S. election as well.
Right, right. Yeah, there'll be much more nail-biting for the Mexican citizens watching our election because it seems like theirs, well, it's early to tell, but for polling reasons, we can see that it's not going to be likely a contested race in Mexico anyway.
I think that's fair.
Yeah. So let me just also say this. One of the things you put in your report is you said 80 nations. That's over 60% of global GDP is the makeup of those 80%, 80 countries, I should say, that are going to the polls this year. So that's an incredible number. What a milestone. We'll remember this year, this election year, as we look down in the history books. So I guess the last thing I would ask you then, Alejo, is just with some investment implications for the investors out there, whether they're sitting here in the U.S. or they're sitting in some other country watching this show, what should they be looking out for, especially with the U.S. election?
Definitely. Look, we put out our House View update recently, and the title was 4 Things a Great Portfolio Cannot Do Without, right? And there we start by recognizing that U.S. large cap stocks have done a lot better than competitors in recent years. But in our analysis, you cannot do without, in terms of portfolio construction, emerging market stocks and European stocks, because these assets provide the diversification and balance in a portfolio that you need when building it. And in addition, the protection to political and geopolitical shocks that are undoubtedly on the rise.
Right. Before I let you go, we've talked about India on our UBS Trending show and sort of the rise of India as an economic powerhouse. Anything to add? I know that they have elections there as well, but it's really, you're focusing a lot on India's current GDP, which is growing.
That's right. Elections in India, 2024, another example. We're talking about general elections. According to polls, Prime Minister Modi has a fairly high probability of winning a 3rd term together with his political coalition. Look, in our view, there are opportunities in India. We are favorable on Indian stocks, but not because of political dynamics. It's more taking into account GDP growth, performance, and earnings growth developments, right? So we think there's an opportunity here, and as we've discussed, in a geopolitically changing world, India plays an increasingly strong role, and your portfolio needs to reflect that.
Right, I was going to say, for U.S. investors, don't sit quietly on India, because your call here in CIO is that we'll see expansion in their GDP throughout this year. So that's exciting to watch.
That's right.
Great. Alejo, always a pleasure. Thanks for joining me. Good to see you.
Thank you for having me.
Great. And thank you all for joining for another episode of UBS's Road to the Election. For more, please visit our full website, ubs.com/election watch. And as you know, this UBS Road to the Election video series is there, plus a lot of other content that you're going to find and will change over the next couple of months. Be on the lookout for our coming Election Watch report later this month and some other details. And we always encourage you to continue this conversation with your financial advisor. Until next time, I'm Anthony Pastore. Have a great day, everyone. We'll see you soon.